Reformed thinking. Welcome to the deep dive. We've gathered some really interesting material today, getting into something that's, well, absolutely core to genuine faith.
hmm
But it's also something the sources we're looking at suggests is, often misunderstood or even faked.
That's right. We're talking about humility. And alongside that, the problem of spiritual pride, which can be surprisingly sneaky, often hiding behind a mask of, well, seeming humility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the stuff before us today, it really tries to draw a clear line. It talks about, what is it, evangelical humiliation.
Yes, that's the term for true Christian humility, and it contrasts that sharply with counterfeit forms, the kind driven by spiritual pride.
Okay, so our mission here, as we sort of wade through these notes and writings, is to pull out the key ideas, the signs. What does genuine humility look like, according to these sources, and how does spiritual pride manifest?
Yeah, the goal is to help you get a clearer sense of these things based on this material, to help you discern, maybe in your own heart or as you look around.
Good. So where do we start? The sources seem to say humility is central, right, to real religion.
Absolutely central, but crucially, not all self-abasement is the same. Just because someone seems low or talks themselves down, it doesn't automatically mean it's the genuine article. There are different kinds.
Okay, different kinds. And that's where this distinction comes in. Legal versus evangelical humiliation.
That's the core distinction presented here, and it's really important to get this. They're not just like different amounts of humility. It's not a spectrum where one is just less humble and the other is more.
Okay.
They're different in their very nature. Different sources, different effects, different spiritual reality altogether. The claim in these texts is pretty stark. Evangelical humiliation belongs only to true saints. It's a fruit of grace. Legal humiliation. Anyone can experience that, even someone with no true spiritual life.
Wow. Okay, that's a strong claim. So let's break that down. Let's start with legal humiliation. What are the sources saying about where that comes from? What does it look like?
So, legal humiliation stems from what the sources call the common influences of the Spirit. This isn't the Spirit regenerating the heart, giving new life. It's more his general work, convicting people through truth.
Like anyone hearing the law or thinking about God's judgment.
Exactly. It works through natural principles already in us. Conscience is a big one. It leverages that innate sense of right and wrong, guilt, fear of consequences.
And the view of God that triggers this.
It comes from grasping God's natural perfections, his sheer greatness, his terrifying majesty, his power, the strictness of his law. Think about Mount Sinai, the thunder, the lightning, the fear. That's the kind of thing.
Right. Contemplating that side of God would definitely make you feel small,
Yeah.
insignificant, powerless.
For sure. And that leads directly to a conviction of sinfulness, a sense of guilt, a terrifying awareness of being exposed to God's wrath, his punishment. The writers compare it to the conviction wicked people, even devils, will feel on Judgment Day.
So it's a real dread, an unavoidable sense of condemnation before this huge, powerful judge.
Yes. And it does make a person feel little, nothing before God, utterly unable to save themselves. That feeling of helplessness can be very strong in legal humiliation.
Okay, despair of self-help. That sounds somewhat like genuine repentance, doesn't it? Feeling you can't save yourself.
It shares that element. But here's the critical difference, according to this material. Legal humiliation does not involve a spiritual sight or understanding of the inherent hatefulness, the odiousness of sin itself.
So it's focused on the danger of sin, the punishment, the offense against God's power or law, but not the intrinsic ugliness of sin against God's goodness or beauty.
Precisely. There's no spiritual grasp of God's moral perfections, his holiness as something beautiful, lovely. And because there's no sight of that beauty, there's no corresponding sight of sin as this, horrible defilement of that beauty.
And without that spiritual understanding.
The will isn't truly bowed. The heart's fundamental inclination isn't changed. There's no genuine desire to humble oneself simply because God alone is worthy of exaltation. Pride, that root of self-exaltation, isn't actually dealt with. It's just sort of pushed down by fear.
Okay, so the person feels small, insufficient, they despair of helping themselves.
Yeah.
But the sources use this phrase, they're subdued and forced to the ground.
Yes. Forced. That's key. It's coercion by fear, by the weight of God's power or judgment or just the pressure of conscience. It's not a willing surrender. The heart might still be fighting inside, but outwardly or in terms of feeling, they feel crushed, pinned down.
And what about its actual spiritual value? Does it achieve anything positive?
The sources are very direct here in itself. No spiritual good, nothing of true virtue or holiness. It's not grace. It's not saving.
Not saving at all.
No. Now, it can be useful. It can act as a means towards true evangelical humiliation. Like, common knowledge of doctrine can be a necessary step before you get spiritual understanding. It can prepare the ground, make someone feel their need.
But it's not the real thing.
Definitely not. And someone can be, deeply humbled in this legal sense, terrified of hell, despairing of their own efforts, feeling vile under conviction, and still have absolutely zero true humility, zero true grace in their heart.
That's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
Okay, that picture of legal humiliation is quite clear. Fear-based, consequence-focused, externally forced, no inner transformation. So now let's pivot to the other kind, the one unique to true saints. Evangelical humiliation. What's its source? What makes it different?
Right. Evangelical humiliation comes not from those common influences, but from the special influences of the Spirit. This is the Spirit's saving work, implanting divine principles, giving a new nature, creating spiritual life. It's rooted in a fundamental internal change worked by God.
And the perception of God that drives it is different too.
Completely different. It arises primarily from a spiritual sense of the transcendent beauty of divine things and their moral qualities, especially God's holiness. Not just seeing holiness as a standard we fail, but seeing it as infinitely lovely, glorious, beautiful in itself.
So it's an attraction to God's character, his moral beauty.
Yes. And it's the spiritual side of God's holy beauty that truly exposes the hateful nature of sin. Sin then appears disgusting, vile, repulsive, not merely because it brings punishment, but because it's an offense against infinite beauty, infinite moral glory. It's like seeing mud splattered on a masterpiece.
That sounds like it must go much deeper in the person.
It absolutely does. This kind of humiliation involves a spiritual understanding that doesn't just inform the mind, it actually bows the will. It alters the inclination of the heart. The deep-seated desires and dispositions begin to change.
How does that happen? Is it still kind of forcing?
The sources say it's achieved by God's holy beauty overcoming the heart. But overcoming here isn't like a violent conquest. It's more like the irresistible pull, the sweet, powerful attraction of infinite spiritual beauty capturing the soul, drawing it away from its old loves. The heart is won over. Its affections are genuinely shifted.
And this is where true spiritual value lies.
Yes. Evangelical humiliation contains spiritual good. It's the very nature of true virtue, true holiness, Christian grace. It's part and parcel of the new spiritual life itself.
Okay, so what kind of disposition does this create in the heart? What does it feel like internally?
It results in what the sources call a mean esteem of oneself. Now, that doesn't mean self-hatred in a destructive way. It means a genuine spiritual awareness of one's own nothingness, vileness, inherent unworthiness in oneself when seen against God's infinite glory.
So a loss of self-importance.
Definitely. And it comes with a mortification, a putting to death of that natural, ingrained tendency to exalt oneself, to seek one's own glory or status.
It sounds like a radical turning away from self.
It really is. It involves a free renunciation of one's own glory, a voluntary giving up of any claim to personal worthiness, merit, or dignity before God. And this produces a deep, lasting disposition to abase oneself and to exalt God alone, because you see, he is infinitely worthy of all glory.
And how does that play out in actions or responses? You said legal humiliation involves being forced. What about this?
Instead of being forced, people are brought voluntarily to deny and renounce themselves. And there's this beautiful phrase used. They are brought sweetly to yield and freely and with delight to prostrate themselves at God's feet.
With delight. That's really striking compared to being forced down.
Isn't it? The self-abasement isn't felt as a burden, but as a joyful, willing response to God's overwhelming beauty and grace. They bow down not because they're terrified of punishment, but because they're captivated by his loveliness, and they recognize his supreme worthiness. It's actually a delight to be nothing, so that he can be everything.
Okay, so the contrast is becoming very clear. Legal. Fear, consequences, external force, no new life. Evangelical,
Right.
beauty, grace, sin's offense against God's nature, internal transformation, the essence of virtue itself.
That sums up the foundational difference really well.
All right, let's go deeper into this evangelical humiliation. How does it actually shape the way true saints, people who have this grace, see themselves? Their spiritual state? The sources list several marks or indicators.
Yeah, they do. One of the first things mentioned is a remarkably low esteem of their own attainments in religion. Even when they are genuinely growing, making real progress in grace, they tend to see their own spiritual achievements as, well, comparatively small, mean, insignificant.
They actually see themselves as low among the saints, maybe even one of the least, and they're inclined to think others are better than them.
Yes, and the sources stress this isn't just saying humble words, it's a genuine tendency of their thinking. They're not constantly ranking themselves, but when the thought arises, their default is to see others as spiritually ahead of them or their own position as quite low.
But why? That seems almost counterintuitive. If you're growing, shouldn't you know it? Shouldn't you feel stronger, more mature? Why see your grace as little and your sin as great?
It's one of those paradoxes of grace the sources highlight. It's precisely because they have more grace, more spiritual light, that they see things this way. This increasing light reveals two things more clearly. First, the infinite reason they should be holy, meaning they see more of God's infinite glory, Christ's infinite dignity, the infinite depth of his love and the grace they've received. Compared to that infinite standard and obligation, their own love, their own thankfulness, their own humility, even if real, just looks incredibly small, pathetic almost, cold, low, deficient.
Ah, okay, so it's not denying the reality of their grace, but seeing it against this vastly expanded backdrop of God's perfection and their debt to him. And that makes their own efforts seem tiny.
Exactly. The more holy they become, the clearer their vision of the infinite standard, which makes them painfully aware of how far short they still fall. And the second thing this light reveals more clearly is the infinite hatefulness of sin, even the smallest sin.
The sources say the least sin has infinite deformity. That's intense.
It is. Spiritual light magnifies this. Like a microscope showing flaws you couldn't see before, this light reveals the truly abominable nature of sin, any sin against the backdrop of God's infinite holiness. The least failing seen in this light makes them feel infinitely deformed, infinitely vile, and that felt ugliness vastly outweighs any beauty they might perceive in their best moments or highest graces.
So growing in grace brings a sharper, more painful awareness of ongoing sinfulness, seen not just as mistakes, but as offenses against infinite beauty.
Right, a deep sense of personal deformity, even amidst growth. And related to this increasing light is another mark, knowledge. The more spiritual knowledge they gain, the more aware they become of their own ignorance.
Again, that sounds backwards. Should more knowledge make you feel, well, more knowledgeable?
Maybe in worldly things. But spiritual light reveals an infinite ocean of truth about God. The more they see, the more they realize the immensity of what they don't know. Their knowledge just pushes the horizon back, showing them how vast their ignorance still is compared to the infinite reality of God.
Okay, what about their view of their own humility?
Oh.
If they have this evangelical humiliation, surely they recognize it.
This is maybe the most striking point. The sources say an eminent saint, someone genuinely very humble, is not likely to think of themselves as eminent in anything, but especially not in humility. Their humility is described as being out of his sight.
Like they don't see it at all.
Almost. It's not completely invisible, perhaps, but they're so much more aware of their lack of humility, the pride they still detect in their hearts, that any actual humility they possess is barely noticeable to them. The texts say they are 1,000 times quicker to spot their own pride than their humility.
We see the pride easily, but the humility hardly at all.
Yes, they never think their humility is great because they see the infinite reason they should be humbled, God's glory, their sin. So even when they feel most humble, they don't feel like they've arrived at true humility. They feel they're still far too high, and they genuinely long to get lower, to be more abased before God.
And that gap between where they feel they are and where they see they should be infinitely low, that's what they perceive as their pride.
Exactly, because the proper place is so incredibly low in the presence of infinite glory, any perceived elevation above that feels like pride to them. They're far more likely to criticize their own pride than anyone else's.
This constant awareness of pride, even while being humble, leads to this ongoing sense of, what do the sources call it, present vileness.
Yes. Even when they're experiencing the heights of grace, strong faith, deep love, spiritual joy, they simultaneously have the sharpest conviction of their own inner deformity, an abasing sense of their present vileness and unworthiness. And it's precisely in those moments of high spiritual exercise that they are most inclined to put themselves in the lowest place among others.
That really sounds like being poor in spirit, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. They feel poor in spirit. The sources use the image of a poor person to describe their behavior. They tend to be yielding, patient, okay with being overlooked or despised, ready to honor others, especially superiors. They take correction quietly, even thankfully. They're easily taught, not pushing their own opinions strongly in spiritual matters.
And this sense of neediness continues.
Yes, even after years of walking with God, they remain like a poor beggar at God's gates, exceeding empty and needy. They know every bit of grace, every good impulse, every spiritual breath is a pure gift. Nothing earned. Total dependence.
That picture of the lifelong beggar is powerful. It drives home the lack of self-reliance and true humility. It makes me think of Moses coming down from the mountain. His face was shining, but he had no idea.
That's a perfect illustration. Oblivious to his own spiritual radiance because his focus was elsewhere on God and likely on his own inadequacy for the task ahead. Deep awareness of shortcomings, not attainments.
Okay, so that gives us a really rich picture of genuine evangelical humility. Now we have to look at the flip side, the counterfeit, what the sources call the serpent of spiritual pride. They describe it as subtle, deeply rooted.
Yes, and dangerous because it often masquerades as great humility. It's described as a kind of legal spirit, still operating in fallen human nature, even within religious people.
What do they mean by legal spirit there?
It means that deep down, the person isn't truly emptied of self, not relying solely on Christ. They are, perhaps subtly, perhaps obviously, leaning on something in themselves as the basis for their acceptance with God, or their spiritual standing, or their sense of worth.
Like what? What kind of things?
It could be anything, really. Their own efforts at righteousness, their morality, their perceived holiness, how intense their religious feelings are, how dramatic their experiences have been, how strong they think their faith is, or even, and this is the really tricky one, how humble they think they are.
So they're basically building a kind of self-righteousness out of spiritual things, even potentially good things.
That's the idea. They're making a currency, a ground for confidence out of something they possess or have done or felt. And the sources give two what they call infallible signs of this spiritual pride, almost dead giveaways. The first one is thinking highly of their own attainments, especially compared to others.
Right, the complete opposite of the truly humble person who thinks others are better and their own growth is small.
Exactly. With spiritual pride, there's this underlying, perhaps secret conviction that they are an eminent saint, that they've had distinguishingly good and great experiences. The internal monologue, even if unspoken, is like the Pharisee in the temple. God, I thank you I'm not like other people, especially not like that person.
In a sense of spiritual superiority.
Yes, and you often see it leak out. They might be quick to take the lead, the high seat, in religious settings, acting like they're the authority, the expert, expecting others to defer to their judgment because of their perceived spiritual status.
They want their experiences to be seen as special, maybe even definitive.
Right. They might talk a lot about their spiritual experiences, framing them as very great or extraordinary. Often, even while giving verbal credit to God, the underlying aim seems to be getting admiration for their own spiritual depth. This eagerness to think highly of their own holiness or experiences is called a sure sign of pride and vanity. It's being wise in one's own eyes. Spiritually, the very thing true spiritual light counteracts by revealing ignorance.
Okay, that's sign number one, thinking highly of their attainments compared to others. What's the second infallible sign?
The second is thinking highly of their own humility.
Okay, that's the paradox again. How does that work? Being proud of being humble.
It's the core deception of spiritual pride. This counterfeit humility is, by its very nature, highly conceited about itself. Because the experiences might be superficial or misunderstood, people can genuinely convince themselves that their humility is profound. They actually admire themselves for being so humble.
They feel incredibly humble, and they're impressed with themselves for feeling that way.
Exactly. The sources use phrases like, they are full as they can hold with the glory of their own humility, lifted up to heaven with a high opinion of their own abasement. It's self-admiration wearing a disguise of self-abasement.
And you mentioned they measure this against an inflated view of their own dignity.
Right. If someone thinks it's a huge act of condescension for them, a worthless worm of the dust, which is our true state by nature to admit they're unworthy, it shows they secretly have a very high opinion of what they think they deserve or who they really are. They think they're stooping down from a great height to admit the basic truth of their condition. This results in what's called a swelling, self-conceited, confident, showy, noisy, assuming humility. It's all performance.
Okay, so spiritual pride can actually manifest as pride and humility. That makes sense now why true humility is out of sight to the person who has it.
Precisely. The truly humble person isn't focused on their humility. They're focused on God's glory and their own sin. The spiritually proud person is focused on their humility as one of their prized spiritual assets.
So how does this counterfeit humility, this spiritual pride, actually show up outwardly? What does this bungling work, as the sources call it, look like in practice?
Well, there are several tells. One big one is making a great show or pretense of humility.
Putting on an act.
Yeah, consciously trying to appear humble. This could be in their speech, their behavior, maybe affected looks or gestures, a certain tone of voice, even deliberately choosing unusually plain or poor clothing, like the Pharisees disfiguring their faces to make sure everyone knew they were fasting. It's about being seen as humble.
And the sources say it lacks a certain genuineness.
Right. They call it bungling work. It doesn't have that sweet, natural, humble air that comes from a genuinely lowly spirit. It often feels strained, artificial, put on.
Another sign mentioned is talking a lot about humility, but without real brokenness.
Yes. They might frequently declare how humble they are or tell stories about times they were deeply humbled. They might use really strong language about themselves. I'm the least of saints. I'm just a poor, vile creature. My heart is worse than the devil.
On the surface, those sound like humble things to say.
They do. But the key is the manner and the underlying spirit. Often these strong, self-deprecating phrases are delivered with a kind of light air, maybe even a slight smile, or what the sources call a pharisaical affectation. It doesn't come across as genuine brokenness, spiritual mourning, or deep conviction.
Why use such strong words then?
The suggestion is that they use these extreme terms not because they are currently crushed by a sense of their vileness, like the true saint often is, but almost as a way to prove how humble they are. They expect others to hear these declarations and think, wow, this person is incredibly humble, truly an eminent saint.
So even while saying these self-debasing things, they have an underlying expectation of being admired or seen as spiritually superior.
That's exactly it. They expect others to look up to them as eminent and bright saints. And the sources warn it can be risky to suggest otherwise. If you were to imply they were just an ordinary weak Christian, they might feel deeply wounded or offended because their identity is wrapped up in this image of spiritual prominence.
And connected to that, there's this blindness to their own pride, combined with being hyper-aware of pride in others.
A classic symptom. They can be incredibly blind to the massive beam of pride in their own eye, yet astonishingly quick to spot the tiniest speck of perceived pride in someone else.
So they readily criticize others for being proud.
Oh, yes, often very vocal about the pride they see elsewhere. And frequently their focus is on external things, criticizing someone's clothes, their lifestyle, their doctrinal expressions perhaps, rather than dealing with the deep-seated pride and filthiness in their own hearts. Some might even rail against legal doctrines taught by others, while their own proud spirit is actually the biggest enemy to understanding free grace, because they're still relying on their own perceived goodness or humility.
Their self-righteous system feels threatened by genuine grace that says you bring nothing.
Precisely. And interestingly, sometimes the outward show isn't even fake meekness. Some spiritually proud people can actually come across as haughty, bold, assuming in their manner. They might have that proud look the Bible condemns, completely contradicting the gentleness and modesty of true Christianity.
The ultimate example given is the Pope, calling himself servant of servants, while acting, historically at least, as supreme ruler.
Yeah, that example drives it home. The title is the lowest possible servant of servants, but the spirit can be the highest self-exaltation, a stark reminder that words and titles don't guarantee the inner reality.
Okay, this contrast is really sharp now. Let's just quickly summarize the self-perception side by side one last time.
Sure. With true evangelical humility, the work of grace, the spiritual light makes sin look bigger, makes your own deformity clearer, and highlights your infinite obligation to God. This leads to genuine self-abasement, seeing yourself as nothing, and a joyful dependence on God alone. You see yourself fundamentally as infinitely unworthy apart from Christ.
Whereas spiritual pride fundamentally elevates the self. It views its own accomplishments or experiences as significant. It compares itself favorably to others. It minimizes or is blind to its own pride, but is an expert at spotting it elsewhere.
And its confidence, its sense of standing, rests ultimately on something within itself, its efforts, its feelings, its experiences, even its performance of humility, not purely on Christ and God's free grace accepted by faith.
And that key difference, true spiritual light uncovers corruption. It makes you painfully aware of how much more love, humility, thankfulness you should have, and that lack becomes a burden driving you to Christ. False light, the kind that puffs up with pride, actually hides your pollution from you.
That's a critical distinction. True humility flows from a broken heart, a contrite spirit. Even the joy experienced by a truly humble person is described as a kind of broken-hearted joy, a joy that doesn't puff up but humbles further, making them feel more like a little child, more dependent, more meek.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. Let's bring it home for you, the listener. How can understanding all this deep dive into legal versus evangelical humiliation, true humility versus spiritual pride, how can this actually help you?
Well, first and foremost, it gives you some tools, some categories for examining your own heart. It pushes past just asking, am I humble? Which is vague. It encourages you to ask why you feel or act a certain way.
Right. Is my sense of unworthiness rooted in seeing God's holy beauty and grace, leading to a willing self-abasement? That's evangelical humility.
Or is it rooted more in fear of punishment, or maybe even a subtle pride in how low I can get? Is there an undercurrent of relying on my experiences, my track record, my perceived insights, or even my performance of humility as a basis for my standing? That could be spiritual pride.
You can use those marks we discussed as diagnostic questions for yourself, can't you?
Definitely. Ask yourself honestly, how do I react when corrected? Do I genuinely tend to esteem others better than myself? When I learn more about God, does it make me feel bigger? Or does it make me more aware of my ignorance and sin? Am I quicker to see fault in myself or in others, especially regarding pride? When I share spiritual things, what's my deeper motivation? Mutual encouragement or seeking a certain kind of regard?
These are pointed questions, but necessary if we want to avoid self-deception.
And secondly, it gives you some caution, some wisdom in how you perceive others. These sources strongly suggest that outward appearances, dramatic confessions, very humble-sounding language, even simple living aren't foolproof indicators of true humility.
The counterfeit can look very convincing.
It can. True humility is often quieter, less self-focused, more interested in honoring God and serving others than in broadcasting its own lowliness. Look for the fruit. The lack of self-exaltation, the genuine teachability, the patience under trial, the quickness to forgive, the consistent focus on Christ rather than self.
So it's a call to careful self-examination and charitable, discerning observation of others, always checking things against the patterns laid out here, and ultimately against Scripture. A vigilance against pride in all its forms.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over from these readings. True humility isn't primarily about focusing on how bad your sin is just because it messes things up or makes you look bad.
It's more profound than that.
It's a fundamental shift in perspective. It's seeing yourself in the light of God's infinite, breathtaking holiness and beauty, and simultaneously grasping the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of His grace towards you in Christ.
Seeing yourself against that backdrop changes everything.
It does. Because when you see that, genuine self-abasement stops feeling like a heavy burden you have to carry or some kind of morbid self-flagellation. It becomes, well, a sweet and voluntary yielding. It becomes almost a relief, a delight to fall down at the feet of such a glorious and gracious God, acknowledging that you are nothing and He is everything, and finding your only worth and dignity not in yourself, but in Him. It flows from love for His beauty and overwhelming gratitude for His grace.
A powerful distinction to keep reflecting on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, exploring these vital differences between true and counterfeit humility as presented in these sources.